Jane, welcome to the Listen.Better podcast. Really pleased you've been able to make time today. I know you're in a busy phase of the business as it grows. Tell me a little bit about what Big Before I Go Solutions is, what inspired you to set it up, and why in particular a social enterprise.
Okay, Before I Go Solutions is a training company that helps people to get their end-of-life plans done. So we spend a lot of time training people to help other people in the form of end-of-life plan facilitators, or we work with organizations to train their staff or even sometimes their customers to feel more comfortable talking about this subject. And the reason that I set it up, this was not part of my plans at all. I had been working as a coach, consultant, trainer for probably 30 years by now. But my husband died, this was 10 years ago. And the result of that, the short story version of this, the result is that because of the book that I wrote at that time and the questions that I asked him before he died, which were really practical things like, what kind of coffin do you want? And what are your passwords? And how do you want your body dressed? That chapter in the book, the first book, was what people reacted to. And I had a lot of people saying, I need to answer these as well. And so I set up Before I Go Solutions. And as to why a social enterprise, well, you know, death, it happens to us all. None of us like to face up to it, but it does happen. And it seemed to me that the format of a community interest company, which is what it is, a social enterprise, was right for this kind of community event, if you like. It is a community event because it happens to one person, but that means it affects the family, it affects the area where you live, it affects the people at work. So yes, a community event. Yeah.
Gosh, well, you started off talking about end-of-life planning. And so for some of our viewers, listeners, they might not be familiar with that. I know about it because we've had some interesting talks and discussions, but tell me a bit more about end-of-life planning.
Yeah, it is a new phrase. And when I started, it definitely wasn't heard of at all. I would say now it is a search term, and it includes the wills and the legals and the funeral plan, which people will probably be familiar with. But it also includes advanced care planning, i.e. thinking ahead to what you might need when you get older and you're not so able. It includes your digital life, which will carry on without you, even if you are dead. So if you don't want that to happen, then you need to think about it in advance. It includes the what happens in your household, not just the financial side of things, which again, people are sometimes familiar with, but who deals with all your stuff, and how does your household work? It's really common that in a couple, for example, one person will know more about the running of the mechanics of it than the other. And if you're left on your own, this is how I discovered this. I was left on my own, and it was not easy to come to terms with some of the things that I didn't know about, like the Wi-Fi and the router system and even the heating system. Anyway, and then there's one other area, which is how you want to be remembered. And actually these days, there's a lot more opportunities to be creative about how you want to be remembered. And for some people, it's not that important, but if you want to leave behind a really lovely legacy, then this is worth thinking about in advance.
Such an interesting idea, and the way you talk about it, it makes it perhaps more palatable to discuss, because I know there's a lot of taboo, particularly in the UK, in the English as a nation, we tend to be much more repressed about our feelings and comfort levels talking about death. So you must have encountered a lot of that in the types of people you're training and meeting, and overcoming that fear and taboo. Is that correct?
Well, I think the people who get attracted to this are the people who are curious, even if they are a bit, concerned. And then there's lots and lots of other people that are not that curious until the seed is planted and they realize that actually this is really important preventative work, or more commonly that they've had a personal experience of somebody close to them dying. Well, of course, a lot of us have had that in the last few years. Because when you realize that, that's when you realize what an enormous amount of work goes on in the lead up to somebody dying, if it's a slow process, and also afterwards, after they have died. There's masses of things to take care of. And if you've never had that happen to you, you just don't know. But even when people do realize that this is important, it's still a challenge to do it, because it isn't easy to face up to this sort of thing, let's face it. And that's why we train people to help you become more at ease with it, let's say, at least at ease with talking about it, and then that can lead to the action.
I can really see the benefit of that as an individual, but you've talked about training in businesses. So
Yeah.
why and how is that useful to an organisation? Why would they be talking to you?
It's really easy to underestimate the effect that grief and bereavement has. And if you are somebody who has a job, then you are going to be affected, of course, because you're a person. But you're probably going to have to go back to work in order to keep the money coming in. But the thing is, I think most people, most employers don't understand about the effect that grief has. So here's some common things. Anxiety, really common. Pointlessness, utter pointlessness, even a job that you loved. In the face of somebody loving, nothing really matters apart from the fact that they've gone and you're devastated. It means that you're probably likely to be less productive. It means that you might well have to take more time off work, whether for mental health reasons or for practical reasons to have to deal with some of the stuff left afterwards. So really what we're doing is we're introducing the idea to organizations to be aware of this beforehand. So the very first thing is to consider having a bereavement policy, and many companies don't have that. But even to consider that means that you have to be talking about dying and death and grief. And so we always start with inviting people to think and talk about this as a subject, as a wide-ranging subject, before we look at more specifics. Yeah, because everything starts with a conversation, really, but most people are afraid of having the conversation in the first place.
I can absolutely resonate with that. I've been through a roller coaster, having lost both my parents over the last few years. So, and how grief can hit you like a shockwave when you're least expecting it is can really be upending. And so, yeah, certainly trying to hold down a job with an employer that doesn't understand what you're going through must be very challenging. But with the pandemic, of course, we're on the back end of that, hopefully, but the news reports were filled daily with numbers of deaths and death tolls, and it seemed sort of omnipresent. Has that impacted your organisation positively, in that more people are coming to you to try and get support? What's the impact been for you?
Do you know, I don't think we've noticed any particular difference, neither less people coming or more people coming. I think it's really easy to read reports or hear reports about the numbers of people dying, and which is what we heard a lot about in the media, but it didn't translate. Research has been done about this to show that did not translate into people having more conversations in advance of this happening. Of course it did for some people, but it's not significant. And which means that, and there's a feeling now around that people have just gone back to how it was. And, you know, 100% of us are going to die. That is the statistic. It's mad that we don't plan ahead for this when we plan ahead for all the other important occasions in our lives, like weddings and births and all that sort of thing. So I think it's really important that we give some thought to this. And because so many people die, so about 500,000 people roughly in the UK die every year. If we estimate 4 people grieving for each of one person dying, that's an enormous amount of people being affected. And I haven't got the figures on the percentage of those at work, but most of them are probably going to be working in one way or another. So that means the potential for impact on a business is high, and especially a small business, because if you're in part of a small team, it affects everybody. You know, like what I said before about community, you can't have somebody die in your family and then come into work, maybe a team of 6 people or whatever it is, and just get on with it as usual. It doesn't work like that. And if people can't talk about it, it's just awful. So I really encourage people to start talking about this subject in one way or another. And that's, of course, what we do.
So you've been doing this for 5-6 years now, Jane. What have you learned since those first early Giddy days when you launched and now?
Giddy days, yeah, that's a good description. Well, I think I naively thought that people would get, as soon as people understood that this was a good idea, that they would do it. And 90% of people, the research shows that 90% of people do think that this is not only a good idea, but essential to do. But actually, and I discovered this as well, only 14% of people did do anything about it. And that's what we discovered anecdotally as well. And that's why we now focus on training other people to help others. So it's a little bit like having a personal coach, or having to go to an exercise class. Like, I know that I won't do my Pilates practice at home, so I have to go to a class twice a week. That's just the way it is. And with this kind of work, you need support to get it done, and that's what we provide. So yeah, that's been quite a big change actually, because the emphasis is really now on training.
Yeah, and again, I absolutely resonate, because I did come along to one of your courses, full declaration, and I have the workbook, and all great intentions, but it sits on the shelf, and it's overcoming that inertia. And yet I'll happily run 10K, but not sit and ponder my end of life plan. So yeah, I understand that's a big block and challenge for you, but when you get to those people and you can put the right support in place, I imagine very, very gratifying and hugely fulfilling for you as an organisation.
It is hugely fulfilling, and the people that we attract to train with us are wanting that kind of fulfillment, of course. And it is. I mean, the thing is, when you help one person, that you're actually helping their whole family, and that is enormously fulfilling. And I think that it's easy to underestimate how grateful people are going to be after somebody has died. Oh my goodness! It's like, when my mom and dad died, which is about 4 years ago now, they had been great students of mine, and they had a workbook filled in, and I knew exactly what to do, and I was their executor. And I was self-employed. I didn't have to take huge amounts of time off, mainly because I just had to go to their workbook and do what they told me to do. But here's the thing, I didn't know up until then that I was going to feel so good about the fact that I was carrying out their wishes, knowing that they knew I would do it. That was a solace to me at a time which was pretty difficult, because they both died in a very short period of time together. So that was comforting, at a time when it was horrible. Even though it's natural for your parents to die and all the rest of it, it's still horrible. So yeah, it's good.
I like the fact that you've expressed that the comfort came through knowing that you were doing what they wished for. And as you say, so many people don't have that knowledge. And then as siblings, particularly if you're dealing with elders who have died, to then have that conversation can really add to the stresses around grief.
Absolutely, because even with families, we've seen this time and time again, even with families who think they get on well, when you add in the extra component of grief, all hell can let loose. That's the worst scenario. The best scenario is that there's disagreements that people eventually, put under the carpet, but who knows how insidious those can be later on. So I highly recommend preventative action.
And without naming names, because of course this must be anonymized, but are there any unusual quirks that people have suggested as part of their end of life planning that they want in place? Can you think of any?
Yeah, sometimes there was one person that I heard of who had recorded his voice before he died, ready to be played at his funeral. Now, that would have been okay for everybody who knew it was coming, but imagine the reaction from the people who didn't know that was coming. I mean, depending on your sense of humor, that's either going to be very funny or utterly awful. So I think death humor is something you have to be a bit careful about, because not everybody relates to the same. But the other thing I think is that the way when people understand a little bit more about what you can have, say, at a funeral, which is the thing that most people will most commonly talk about, then you can hear of people being, instead of being taken off in a hearse, they're taken off in a motorbike and sidecar, or they're the person who had was taken in a JCB, I think it was, a truck, because that had been his business. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, because you want the end of life celebration, whatever it is, to be personal to you. That's what people really care about, the people coming after. So, but you have to organize it beforehand.
Absolutely, gosh. And I know, again, from experience, the whole digital side of someone's passing and the complications of passwords and access and bank accounts and so forth. I guess that's all part of your workbooks.
It is, because one of the things that people tend to forget is the things that they use every day. So how you get into your phone, how you get into your computer. I know you're not supposed to tell anybody else your password, but frankly, even if you're using a password manager and you only have to remember one password to get access to all of them, somebody else needs to know that. Somebody else needs to know it, because otherwise it's going to be really hard. And it does happen that people die suddenly. And like I heard this the other day with a woman who was 52. She just didn't wake up one morning. I mean, very unusual, but it does happen. And her mum was distraught because she couldn't even tell anybody, because she couldn't get into her daughter's phone, which is where all the contacts were. So, you know, better to prepare in advance and think about these sorts of things and take the action that needed to make sure that isn't going to happen.
And so can I ask you a delicate question? Is it like the carpenter's door hanging off? Have you done your workbook, Jane? Does everyone know what your wishes are, or will they know?
I have done my workbook. And in a way, a workbook, we're talking about a before I go workbook here, which is your end of life plan, it's a living document while you're still alive, because we live and we change, and you know, there's probably going to be a lag behind when you haven't quite updated it. But yes, I do have one, and I'm really hot on that, actually. Nobody that trains with me can be a licensed facilitator unless they've got their plan done. So I don't think that's in integrity otherwise. So yeah, I have.
Very good. Well, I hope it's a very long time before that's implemented. Just before I come on to the last question, Jane, what would good look like for Before I Go in the next perhaps 5 to 10 years? What's success going to be like?
Well, you know what? We're a social enterprise, which usually exists to solve a problem. And once the problem is solved, you don't need to exist anymore. But I don't think that's going to happen in 5 to 10 years. But if it did, that would be amazing, because it would mean that everybody's talking and acting on the very stuff that we've been talking about. So I think it might take a bit longer, but I do foresee a point in time where actually that might not need to happen anymore. Although maybe the help to actually get things done, which is another matter, still would be needed. But that's what I would love to see. Is our mission is to have end-of-life plans be as commonplace as birth plans. And if that was the case, then it would be a very different world that we're living in.
Fantastic. And sounds like you're well on your way with End of Life Now, a search term, which is a breakthrough. So congratulations to you and all the team.
Thank you.
Let's look at the other end of your life. So if you could throw yourself back to when you were an 18-year-old, what advice would you have given yourself at 18 with all the knowledge you've acquired along the way?
You know, I would have said, trust your instincts. Trust your instincts and stop believing other people are better than you and know better. Because I've got into such trouble in my life in various different ways by not trusting my instincts. And it would have been a lot easier. Might have had a lot easier journey, let's put it that way, if I had done that. And now, you know, towards the other end, I'm much more willing and able to do that. I have a lot more confidence to do that. But I definitely would say that to anyone who's 18 now. So
fabulous. Love that. I wish I'd had that advice at 18. It's whether we take it, that's the challenge, isn't it?
No.
Thank you so much for your time today, Jane. Really enjoyed hearing a little bit more about Before I Go Solutions, and we'll put some links up with this so that people know where to come and find you, and hopefully there'll be some more people talking about end-of-life planning in the coming months and years.
And that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane.